Good morning. Welcome to episode 48 of the Driller Newscast, your weekly update on the news and stories impacting the water and drilling industry. I'm your host, Brock Yordy. This week in the news, federal funding of $580 million was approved for the tribal nations. It's great news. Next, 6 of the 7 Colorado River Compact states submitted a letter to the Interior before the January 31st deadline. Which state didn't? For our feature this week, we will break down U.S. water consumption, where it's coming from, who's using the most. But before we talk about water, let's discuss air in this week's safety topic. For this week's safety, I had a request from Joshua Lockhart to discuss carbon monoxide poisoning. Joshua asked, do you have any tips or suggestions to deal with exhaust and carbon monoxide when drilling in enclosed spaces? There's plenty of different places where this can come up, from mining situations, subsurface, to working in parking structures, working in basements. And then, of course, it's been super cold out, so we're all working in an enclosed drilling space. Yes, first and foremost, we need to ensure we pipe exhaust away from our enclosed space and that we utilize well-ventilated systems and an air quality monitor at all times. And we have to understand the risk of carbon monoxide. This one scares the hell out of me. It's invisible, it's colorless, it's odorless, it's tasteless. Because it has no warning properties, it appears non-existent. In the absence of these identifiable warning properties, it's absolutely imperative that we think about how we're going to detect it, because it's impossible for us as humans to sense it and be aware of its presence. I will say one thing. Our head, our heart, our nervous system is one of the most complex warning devices we can have. And we need to pay attention to that spidey sense. And when we start feeling a little funky, carbon monoxide may be present with any activity using gasoline, diesel, or propane powered machinery. The same as if we're working with hot work items. Carbon monoxide enters the lungs. It combines with hemoglobin to become carboxyhemoglobin. What is that? It's a combination of that carbon monoxide and our hemoglobin, and it's stealing that way that our oxygen goes with our hemoglobin to get out to the tissues and the rest of our body. So once combined, that hemoglobin is no longer available to transport oxygen to tissues. The chemical bond attraction for carbon monoxide to hemoglobin is 200 times stronger than that of oxygen's bond with hemoglobin. Once established on the hemoglobin, carbon monoxide's bond is 50 times tighter. It inhibits your body's ability to carry oxygen to body tissues and vital organs, like your nervous system, your brain, your heart, and your lungs, which will all be dramatically affected. The current OSHA permissible exposure limit for carbon monoxide is 50 parts per million of air, as in an 8-hour time-weighted average. That's a work day for concentration. Let's talk about parts per million for a second. I just learned this tip. 4 eye drops in a 55-gallon drum is equivalent to 1 parts per million. Now, beyond that, what OSHA has stated, NIOSH, the National Institute for Occupational Safety and Health, has established a recommended exposure limit, that's the REL, for carbon monoxide of 35 parts per million, as in an 8-hour time-weighted, and 200 parts per million as a ceiling. The NIOSH limit is based on the risk of cardiovascular effects. Think about that. Cardiovascular effects. It's making carboxyhemoglobin, and it's robbing oxygen from being able to get to our heart and the rest of our tissues. The American Conference of Governmental Industrial Hygienists has assigned a carbon monoxide threshold limit. You will see TLV of 25 parts per million as a time-weighted average for a normal 8-hour workday and a 40-hour work week. This limit is based on the risk of elevated carboxyhemoglobin level symptoms. So, what do these symptoms look like? If you're exposed to 200 parts per million, you're possibly going to have a headache in the middle frontal area after about 2 to 3 hours. And depending on Monday Night Football or whatever's going on and being dehydrated and being funky on that Tuesday morning, you ignore it and you just toughen up. But again, that's your greatest safety device that we have, our nervous system and our brain telling us something's wrong. At 400 parts per million, that headache in the frontal lobe, along with nausea after about 1 to 2 hours exposure. At 800 parts per million, you're going to have that headache immediately. You're going to feel dizziness and nausea. And about 45 minutes, you could collapse and possibly become unconscious. In 2 hours, it's a bad situation. At 1,200 parts per million, of course, bad headache, dizziness, nausea. In about 20 minutes, you can collapse and possibly be dead in 2 hours. So I want you to think about the time-weighted average and the permissible exposure limits and what's happening over 8 hours over a full week. And we can have exposure in trenches. That's why we need air quality monitors in trenches. We could be at a busy intersection. There's so many different places where carbon monoxide can pool from exhaust from other vehicles' traffic. But the big piece here to think about is having that air quality monitor and understanding that the longer you're exposed, the more the toxicity builds up. That carboxyhemoglobin happens and is robbing your ability from being able to transport oxygen. There are stories of good construction workers ending up at the hotel at night and falling and hitting their head from that lack of oxygen in the bathroom and nobody finding them. Or they saying it must have been a substance abuse or something like that until they do the autopsy. So this is a big deal. And as an industry, we definitely need to be thinking about piping away that exhaust, understanding our air quality monitors, making sure we have well-ventilated areas. And that's tough when it's super cold outside and we're trying to make everything as tight as possible, but we have to be ventilated. And that air quality monitor and our nervous system and our brain is telling us that frontal lobe headache is a great sign. And we need to say, stop and leave the area. And then we also need to start discussing that time-weighted average and how much toxicity we have poisoned our body over that time. This is a great question. I'm happy I didn't try to cover it in 3 minutes and ask Brock. Thank you, Joshua. Everybody be safe and think about this. This week in the news, it happened and we should have a huge celebration about this. The Department of Interior announced a nearly $580 million allocation to continue fulfilling settlements of the Indian water rights claims using funding from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law and Reclamation Water Settlement Fund. Water is a sacred resource, and water rights are crucial to ensuring the health, safety, and empowerment of the tribal communities. Through this funding, the Interior Department will continue to uphold our trust responsibilities and ensure that tribal communities receive the water resources they have long been promised. That was from Secretary Deb Hadlin. She continued with, I am grateful that tribes, some of whom have been waiting for this funding for decades, are finally getting the resources they are owed with the help of this crucial funding from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law. This law invests more than $13 billion directly into tribal communities across the country. That includes $2.5 billion to implement the Indian Water Rights Settlement Completion Fund, which will help deliver long-promised water resources to tribes and to all their non-native neighbors. This is big for the Western United States. It creates a solid foundation for future economic development for entire communities dependent on common water resources. The department will allocate nearly $460 million from the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law Indian Water Rights Settlement Completion Fund this year for settlements enacted prior to November 15th of 2021. And then next, $120 million from the Reclamation Water Settlement Fund. The Reclamation Water Settlement Fund was created by Congress in 2009 and receives $120 million in mandatory funding annually. It's big funding out there, everybody, for groundwater. There were 34 congressionally enacted Indian water rights settlements as of November 15th, 2021. With the Bipartisan Infrastructure Law, tribal nations' water rights are vested property rights for which the United States has the trust responsibility. The federal policy supports the resolution of disputes regarding Indian water rights through negotiated settlements. Settlements of Indian water rights disputes break down barriers. It helps create a condition that improves water resource management by providing certainty as to the rights of all water users who are parties to the disputes. And this leads in, and yes, it may sound like the most pertinent news we have right now is the Western United States, from tribal water rights to the Colorado River. There's just a lot going on, and it's going to run into the rest of the country. What's happening west is coming east. And that moves us on to our next story. 6 of the 7 Colorado River states attempted an alternative solution discussion through a letter that was submitted January 31st, which was the deadline given by the Department of Interior. The Interior told the 7 Colorado River Compact states to reduce water consumption by 30%. So 6 of the states submitted a letter with action items leading to a preferred alternative solution. Can you guess what state held out? Maybe the most senior. The states of Arizona, Colorado, Nevada, New Mexico, Utah, and Wyoming jointly submitted the consensus-based modeling alternative. And the states remain committed to working cooperatively with their local water users, the federal government, and other basin states, basin tribes, non-governmental organizations, and stakeholders throughout the reclamation's environmental review in accordance with the National Environmental Policy Act. While the consensus-based modeling alternative is not formally an agreement between the Colorado River Basin states, it serves as an alternative framework for reclamation to analyze in its process. See, we have to start somewhere, and this drought is 20 years now, and we're seeing with what we talked about with the massive rains and everything happening right now, that sure, well, we're seeing both Lake Powell and Lake Mead up, and we're seeing some changes, but this is going to take 50 years. Who knows how long in us getting it right in order. And this study is pivotal. So this analyzation process provides an approach to help protect the Glen Canyon Dam and the Hoover Dam infrastructure, which is major for water and power production. So water deliveries and power productions to mitigate the risk of either Lake Powell or Lake Mead reaching a dead pool. The notice anticipates that alternatives would make specific modifications to Lake Powell and Lake Mead operations governed by the Colorado River Interim Guidelines for Lower Basin Shortages and coordinated operations for Lake Powell and Lake Mead. These guidelines started in 2007. And the idea was to prevent Lake Powell and Lake Mead from falling to critically low elevations, impacting water delivery or power production from either reservoir. The notice anticipates that alternatives would provide for increased lower division states, those are Arizona, California, Nevada, that they would increase more delivery reductions when Lake Mead is below elevation of 1,050. Last week, we covered the atmospheric rivers, which saw both Lake Mead and Lake Powell's levels rise. Forecasters now expect Lake Mead to finish this year around 1,027 feet elevation, about 19 feet lower than its current level. But that's about 7 feet higher than what we expected for the end of 2023 elevation. This was according to the Las Vegas Review-Journal. Now, Lake Powell, the reservoir on the Arizona-Utah border, is now expected to finish this year at 3,543 feet, or 16 feet higher than last month's forecast and about 19 feet higher than its current level. Last August, California proposed to cut 400,000 acre-feet of water from their allotment. That was their adjustment, but they did not collaborate with the 6 other states. Without a consensus from all 7 states, we still have a possibility of the Department of the Interior creating a plan without the participations of the states. This is critical mass when it comes to water, when it comes to power production, when it comes to security of our country. It is also important to remember that states beyond the Colorado River Compact, that's Texas and New Mexico, count on water from Colorado. And within that Colorado River Compact, Mexico has an allocation of 1.5 million acre-feet under a treaty with the U.S. from 1944. So this is a big deal. We still got a lot to go. And we're talking about tribal lands having rights to their water, which 100% is part of this entire discussion and allocation of what we have for water out there. And that's why we're going to move into this week's feature on water consumption in the United States. For this week's feature, let's break down water use in the United States. The United States water use was approximately 322 billion gallons per day, which was from a study in 2015 by the United States Geological Survey. 322 billion gallons is just under 1 million acre-feet. I want you to think about that. California just said they would reduce by 400,000 acre-feet. 322 billion gallons. There's 326 billion gallons and 1 million acre-feet. Of that 322 billion gallons a day we consume in the United States, 87% of that is fresh water. And how does that break down? Because I know what we hear, it's all agriculture. It's the residents is not consuming that much of it. And you're right. And as of the 2015 study, thermoelectric power made up 133 billion gallons a day of that. And then, yes, agriculture was 118 billion gallons a day as of 2015. And those two accounted for the 2 largest withdrawals. With thermoelectric power plants' use of water for cooling, that's why geothermal and alternative energies are so important. This is all combined with what's happening with the global climate crisis, our energy problems, our water problems, the drought, they're all succinct. So agriculture actually in 2017 overtook that largest consumptor. And that report was from the census of the agricultural report, which stated that irrigation had taken over thermoelectric power. Which state? Nebraska had the most irrigated land among all U.S. states, with 8.6 million acres of irrigated cropland, accounting for 14.8% of all irrigated cropland in the United States. The prevalence of irrigated acreage in Nebraska relates to the abundance of groundwater resource, as much of the state overlies the high plains with the Ogallala Aquifer. That was a statement from 2017. what have we been talking about? It's 6 years later. What's going on with the Ogallala? And it was much before that. However, California ranked second, 7.8 million acres, or 13.5% of all U.S. irrigated cropland. And it's rounded out by Arkansas, Texas, Idaho for the top 5 states in total irrigated cropland acreage in 2017. Texas and California have the most House seats, everybody. The 20 highest ranking states in irrigated acreage accounted for about 90% of all irrigated land in 2017. In 2015, from the USGS, California and Texas accounted for 16% of the US water withdrawal total. And then it followed by Idaho, Florida, Arkansas, New York, Illinois, Colorado, North Carolina, Michigan, Montana, and Nebraska, which all of those states combined, now we talked about Nebraska being the most for irrigated cropland, but that's 50% of all of the United States water withdrawals of that 322 billion gallons a day. So let's talk residential. The average American family uses more than 300 gallons of water per day at home. It basically breaks down to this. 80% of that 300 gallons is for bathroom breaks and cleaning. Approximately 87% of the US population relies on public water supplies. So I've been saying for the last year now, about 15% of our population, 40 million Americans, rely on domestic water wells. And it could even be a little less than that. Surface water accounts for 74% of all water withdrawals. So why do we talk a lot about waters of the United States and ephemeral streams and this idea of it's okay for Sackett versus the EPA because they're affecting their land, but then the tribal nations can't have their sovereign water rights because that's going to take away from the most senior water rights holders? It's because this fight is all about surface water, everybody. And yeah, we are the drilling industry and the groundwater industry, but think about how it's all interconnected. There are approximately 152,000 publicly owned water systems that provide water for human consumption. Less than 15,000 of those water supply systems, those publicly owned, supply 80% of our country's population. So think about that. 13 to 15% of our population is on a water well. 80% of our country gets water from 15,000 municipalities. The average person in the US consumes about 156 gallons a day. And I know we just talked about the 300 gallons a day household consumption, but I want to break it down a little bit bigger. The average person in France, 77 gallons a day. The average person in India, 38 gallons a day. The average person in Malai, 3 gallons a day. We are unequivocally one of the largest water consumptors in the world. China has us. India doesn't. India is at 38 gallons a day. China's the biggest, and then it's us. In 2022, and we're going to talk more about what NASA's doing with groundwater. Why are rocket scientists talking about water? Because if we're going to colonize, we need water. But they're doing all sorts of studies. There's a 2022 analysis by NASA. NASA suggests that 13 of the world's 37 largest aquifers have been depleted to the point where regional water availability is threatened. The greatest one that's overstressed in the world is the Arabian aquifer system. As we look at the glass wall construction project happening in Saudi Arabia, or all of the large population bases and whatnot. I want you to think about all of this and where we are in water consumption. And this is why the debate over the waters of the United States and how we protect our clean water and what's happening with our water infrastructure and the importance of our voice being heard for water wells, for private water wells, when 87% of the country writes a check every quarter or maybe every month to a municipality and doesn't think about it. It's a big piece. We are a very important, vital piece of the water industry, but we have to know where our voice is being heard and how water consumption is being used, and having that education to be able to continue to feed that information to the right people. Educate everybody around you the importance of private water wells, groundwaters, and the Clean Water Act. Thank you for joining us for episode 48 of the Driller Newscast. There's a lot going on. Safety this week, huge. Let's make sure that carbon monoxide and exhaust, air quality monitor, well ventilated areas, and that stuff's piped off. This is a serious deal. And I think we all know an industry story of a huge snowstorm coming in or something and somebody being killed by carbon monoxide poisoning. So it's a big deal. Water, everybody. We're in the greatest industry providing the most precious resource. And it's time for us to make sure that we are up to date and educated. Have a great week. Check out thedriller.com. Ask Brock 200 is coming up right around the corner. Thanks, everybody.